It was just after noon on March 19, 1964, when a father and his two sons made a discovery that would change the city of Elmira, New York, forever. They had been walking through a wooded area southwest of the city, a quiet stretch of land that few people had reason to visit. Hidden beneath rocks, branches, and loose brush was the body of a 12-year-old girl who had been missing for 4 days. Until that moment, there was still hope that Mary Theresa Simpson might simply have wandered away or found shelter with friends or relatives. That hope ended in an instant. For the investigators arriving at the scene, one question immediately overshadowed every other. Who had done this? It would take more than 6 decades before they could answer it. By then, many of the original detectives would be gone. Advances in science that did not exist in 1964 would become essential. Thousands of pages of investigative files would be revisited. A tiny amount of preserved biological evidence would survive decades of storage. And an investigation that once seemed destined to remain unsolved would finally reach a conclusion no one in Elmira could have imagined when Mary disappeared. But in March of 1964, none of that was known. All police had was a crime scene, a grieving family, and the realization that someone capable of killing a child had vanished without leaving an obvious trail. To understand how the investigation unfolded, detectives first had to understand the ordinary day that had suddenly become extraordinary. Mary Theresa Simpson had recently returned to Elmira with her father after a brief stay in nearby Hammondsport. Her parents had separated the previous year, and although the family had experienced significant changes, Mary's routine remained familiar. She spent time with relatives, visited family members, and walked through neighborhoods she knew well. Nothing about Sunday, March 15, suggested it would become the final day of her life. That afternoon, Mary left her father's apartment. She told him she was going to visit a cousin. Instead, she first stopped to see her mother. The visit lasted about an hour. There was nothing unusual about it. They talked, spent time together, and Mary eventually left, planning to continue to her cousin's home. Neither parent had any reason to believe they were saying goodbye. After leaving her mother's residence, Mary visited her cousin as planned. Again, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. She laughed, talked, and eventually prepared to walk home. The distance was short enough that no one considered it dangerous. Children walked those streets every day. At approximately 6:30 that evening, Mary left her cousin's house. Sometime around 7 o'clock, a friend saw her near a neighborhood store. The encounter was brief. Mary appeared calm. She mentioned she was heading home. That conversation became the final confirmed sighting of her alive. When she failed to arrive home later that evening, concern began to grow. Hours passed. Friends had not seen her. Relatives had no explanation. By around 11 o'clock that night, Mary's father contacted police to report that his daughter was missing. From today's perspective, it is easy to assume that a missing 12-year-old would trigger an immediate large-scale search. But policing in 1964 was different. Investigators initially considered the possibility that Mary had stayed with relatives or friends without informing her father. Runaway reports involving children and teenagers were not uncommon, and there was little immediate evidence suggesting a violent crime. Still, officers began making inquiries. They contacted family members. They checked locations where Mary was known to spend time. They questioned neighbors and acquaintances. Each conversation ended the same way. No one knew where she was. As Monday turned into Tuesday, the concern deepened. Mary had no history of disappearing for days. She had left behind everything she would normally need. The possibility that she had simply chosen not to come home became increasingly difficult to accept. The search expanded. Police officers, volunteers, friends, and neighbors combed streets, vacant buildings, wooded areas, and fields surrounding Elmira. Word spread quickly through the community. Parents who had once allowed their children to walk freely now watched them more closely. Conversations shifted from optimism to uncertainty. If Mary had been taken, every passing hour made finding her alive less likely. Investigators began interviewing anyone who might have crossed paths with her on the evening she disappeared. Witnesses placed her near familiar streets. No one reported seeing her enter a vehicle. No one described a struggle. No one recalled hearing cries for help. The absence of witnesses became one of the investigation's earliest and most frustrating obstacles. If someone had approached Mary, it appeared to have happened quickly. Detectives reconstructed her expected route home again and again. They measured distances. They estimated walking times. They searched for locations where someone could intercept a child without attracting attention. Yet every reconstruction ended with the same unanswered question. Where had Mary gone after she was last seen? For days after her disappearance, the search entered a devastating new phase. The wooded area where Mary's body was discovered lay away from the busy streets she would normally have traveled. Investigators immediately noticed that someone had attempted to conceal the remains beneath natural debris. That decision carried important implications. Whoever had left her there had not abandoned the scene in haste. There had been time to cover the body. Time to think. Time to leave without being seen. Crime scene investigators carefully documented every detail. Every branch. Every stone. Every impression in the ground. Every item that might later become evidence. Even in 1964, experienced detectives understood that a homicide scene could reveal information invisible during the first examination. The autopsy established that Mary had been sexually assaulted before she died. Her death was ruled a homicide caused by strangulation. Investigators also documented natural debris in and around her airway, evidence that would later become part of the case record. For detectives, the findings confirmed what many had already feared. This was not an accidental death. It was the deliberate killing of a child. The investigation immediately changed in both scale and urgency. Elmira police requested assistance from neighboring agencies. Experienced investigators were assigned to the case. Information was shared across jurisdictions in New York and Pennsylvania. Tips began arriving from every direction. Some callers believed they had seen suspicious vehicles. Others remembered strangers in the neighborhood. Each lead required time to evaluate. Most ended where they began. Without answers. As investigators worked through the growing volume of information, another challenge emerged. There appeared to be no obvious connection between Mary and her attacker. Nothing in her daily routine suggested she had arranged to meet anyone. Friends described an ordinary young girl. Family members could identify no ongoing conflicts. Teachers had noticed nothing unusual before her disappearance. The lack of an apparent relationship raised a troubling possibility. Mary may have encountered someone entirely by chance. If that were true, investigators faced one of the most difficult types of homicide to solve, a crime involving a victim and offender who may never have known one another. That possibility dramatically expanded the pool of potential suspects. Instead of focusing on a small circle of acquaintances, detectives now had to consider virtually anyone who could have crossed Mary's path during the short walk home. The investigation grew rapidly. Officers interviewed hundreds of individuals. Backgrounds were examined. Alibis were checked. Neighborhoods were revisited repeatedly. Search teams returned to wooded areas looking for overlooked evidence. Despite the intensity of the effort, the case resisted every attempt to solve it. The city had expected an arrest. Instead, each new day brought more questions than answers. And while detectives were working tirelessly to identify the person responsible, they had no way of knowing that one of the most important pieces of evidence collected during those first days would not reveal its significance for another 60 years. Investigators knew that solving the case depended on one thing above all else: reconstructing Mary's final movements with as much precision as possible. Every witness statement was placed against a timeline. Every estimated walking time was measured. Every confirmed sighting became an anchor point. The reconstruction began with what detectives could verify. On the afternoon of March 15, Mary left her father's apartment, telling him she planned to visit her cousin. Before going there, she stopped to see her mother. The visit lasted about an hour before she continued on to her cousin's home. Those visits established something important. Mary's afternoon followed a familiar routine. There was no indication that she expected to meet anyone else or that she believed she was in danger. By early evening, she left her cousin's house to walk home. A friend saw her near a neighborhood store at approximately 7 o'clock. The exchange was brief. Mary appeared relaxed. She said she was on her way home. After that moment, the timeline became blank. For detectives, the unanswered question wasn't simply where Mary had gone. It was how she had disappeared so completely. The route home was not isolated wilderness. It passed through neighborhoods where people were still outside on a Sunday evening. Children played. Families returned from church or weekend visits. Businesses remained open. Someone should have seen something. Investigators revisited the route repeatedly. Could Mary have accepted a ride? Could someone have approached her on foot? Could she have been forced into a vehicle without attracting attention? Each possibility carried problems. There were no confirmed reports of screams. No reliable witness described an abduction. No one recalled seeing a child struggling with an adult. That absence of direct evidence became one of the defining characteristics of the case. If an offender intercepted Mary, the encounter was likely brief, controlled, and over before anyone nearby recognized that a crime was unfolding. As the search for answers continued, detectives widened their inquiry. Hundreds of interviews followed. Neighbors were questioned. Local residents were asked whether unfamiliar vehicles had been parked in the area. Workers whose jobs brought them through Elmira were identified and interviewed. Travelers passing through the city became part of the investigation. Each interview added another piece to an enormous puzzle. Few pieces connected. Some witnesses remembered seeing unfamiliar cars. Others recalled strangers walking nearby. Many accounts conflicted with one another. Memory, particularly after several days, can become uncertain. Investigators had to separate observations made at the time from recollections shaped by later events. Tips poured into police headquarters. Some came from concerned citizens genuinely trying to help. Others were based on rumor. Several identified possible suspects who were ultimately eliminated. Each lead demanded time. Every claim required verification. The investigation steadily expanded. In total, detectives interviewed approximately 300 people during the early stages of the case. For a city the size of Elmira, it was one of the most extensive homicide investigations local authorities had ever undertaken. Searches extended well beyond Mary's expected route home. Vacant buildings were examined. Wooded areas were searched again. Junkyards were inspected. Nearby jurisdictions were notified in case anyone matching a suspicious description had been seen elsewhere. Nothing produced the breakthrough investigators needed. At the same time, forensic science imposed limitations that are difficult to appreciate today. Modern audiences are accustomed to DNA databases, surveillance cameras, mobile phone records, and digital location histories. None of those tools existed in 1964. Crime scene investigators relied on physical observation, witness testimony, fingerprints when available, and laboratory techniques that, while advanced for the period, were limited by comparison with today's technology. The evidence collected from Mary's case was handled according to the best practices of the era. Investigators carefully documented the scene. Clothing and biological evidence were preserved. Items recovered during the examination were catalogued rather than discarded. That decision would prove extraordinarily important decades later. At the time, however, no one could have predicted how valuable those preserved materials would become. The detectives could only work with the technology available to them. As weeks turned into months, attention inevitably shifted toward identifying possible suspects. Police examined individuals whose backgrounds appeared concerning. They investigated reports of suspicious behavior. Anyone whose movements could not be readily explained was scrutinized. One question persisted. Did Mary know the person who killed her? Investigators searched for any indication that she had been lured by someone familiar. They interviewed relatives. They spoke with classmates. Teachers and family friends were asked whether anyone had taken an unusual interest in her. Nothing pointed toward a known relationship. Gradually, another theory became more persuasive. Perhaps Mary had encountered a stranger. If that were true, the investigation faced a fundamental obstacle. Without a prior connection between victim and offender, there were far fewer investigative paths to follow. A stranger could arrive, commit the crime, and disappear without leaving a recognizable trail. That possibility also explained another troubling feature of the case. No obvious motive connected to Mary's personal life ever emerged. There were no disputes. No known threats. No evidence that she had been specifically targeted by someone within her family or social circle. Instead, investigators increasingly considered the possibility that Mary's path had crossed with the wrong person at the worst possible moment. Even so, they resisted drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. Experienced detectives understood that assumptions can narrow an investigation too early. Every plausible lead continued to be examined. As public concern grew, local media devoted extensive coverage to the case. Newspaper headlines followed every development. The city wanted answers. Parents wanted reassurance. Investigators encouraged anyone with information to come forward. A reward was offered for information leading to an arrest. When early efforts produced no decisive leads, the amount was increased in hopes that someone who had remained silent might finally speak. No tips solved the case. The reward remained unclaimed. Behind the scenes, detectives continued reviewing witness statements. Small inconsistencies drew attention. Someone might remember seeing a vehicle but disagree about its color. Another witness might recall the approximate time differently. Each variation forced investigators to ask whether memories were simply fading or whether an important detail had been overlooked. One recurring challenge was distinguishing between information that had been independently observed and details people learned after the crime became public. As media coverage expanded, memories sometimes blended with newspaper reports or conversations among neighbors. Detectives had to weigh each statement carefully before incorporating it into the timeline. The process was painstaking. Hours were spent comparing interview notes. Maps were marked and revised. Possible routes were drawn, erased, and drawn again. Yet no reconstruction fully explained how Mary disappeared without a reliable witness observing the critical moment. The investigation eventually reached a difficult reality. Despite the enormous effort, there was no suspect who could be charged. No eyewitness could identify an offender. No physical evidence available through the science of the day pointed conclusively to one individual. The case gradually entered what investigators refer to as a cold phase. That did not mean it was abandoned. Files remained open. Evidence stayed in storage. Occasionally, new information prompted detectives to revisit earlier interviews or re-examine old reports. Each review ended the same way. The evidence simply wasn't enough. Years became decades. Children who had grown up hearing about Mary's murder became adults. Some of the original investigators retired. Others passed away. Technology transformed nearly every aspect of criminal investigation, but Mary's case remained unsolved. To many in Elmira, it seemed possible that the person responsible would never be identified. Yet hidden among the carefully preserved evidence from 1964 was something the original detectives could not fully use, but refused to discard. It occupied little space in an evidence locker. It attracted little public attention. For years, it appeared to offer no answers at all. When forensic science eventually caught up with the evidence, investigators would discover that one decision made more than half a century earlier had quietly preserved the possibility that the truth was still waiting to be found. For decades, the evidence remained exactly where investigators had left it. Boxes were moved as offices changed. Case files were reorganized. Detectives retired and handed responsibility to new generations of investigators who knew the murder only through photographs, reports, and handwritten interview notes. Every few years, someone would reopen the file. The questions never changed. Who killed Mary Theresa Simpson? Could anything still be learned from evidence collected in 1964? For a long time, the answer appeared to be no. The case had reached the point where every obvious lead had been exhausted. Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Memories had faded. Even if someone had decided to come forward decades later, investigators understood that recollections would be far less reliable than they had been in the months immediately following the crime. But while memories fade, physical evidence does not, provided it has been preserved. That distinction would become the foundation of the investigation's second life. By the early 2000s, DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases that once depended almost entirely on eyewitness testimony could now be revisited through biological evidence that had remained silent for decades. Investigators began asking a simple question. Did Mary's case contain any evidence suitable for modern testing? The answer was yes. Evidence collected in 1964 had been preserved carefully enough that scientists believed they could attempt DNA analysis. That fact alone spoke volumes about the original investigators. They could not have predicted the science that would exist 40 or 60 years later. Yet by preserving evidence instead of discarding it, they unknowingly left future investigators an opportunity they themselves never had. The samples were submitted for testing. In 2003, scientists succeeded in developing a male DNA profile from biological evidence associated with the case. For detectives, it represented the first major scientific breakthrough since Mary's murder. At last, they had something that belonged to the killer. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't a confession. But it was a unique genetic profile. The profile was entered into CODIS, the combined DNA index system maintained by law enforcement. If the offender had previously been arrested for qualifying offenses or later entered the database, investigators hoped the system would generate a match. They waited. No match came. The DNA profile remained unidentified. The breakthrough had become another dead end. Still, detectives refused to discard the evidence. Technology continued improving. More sensitive testing methods became available. Years later, the evidence was examined again. Scientists were able to refine portions of the genetic profile. Investigators once again searched available databases. Once again, the result was the same. No identification. The frustration was profound. They possessed the offender's DNA, yet had no way of determining whose DNA it was. The murderer had effectively become an anonymous genetic profile. By then, another generation of investigators had inherited the case. Unlike the detectives of 1964, they understood that DNA alone was not always enough. If the person had never entered a criminal database, traditional DNA matching could not identify them. The investigation needed a different approach. That approach emerged through one of the most significant developments in modern forensic science. Forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA database searches, forensic genealogy does not rely on finding the exact individual in a law enforcement database. Instead, it searches for biological relatives through publicly available or consent-based genetic data, allowing genealogists to construct family trees that can eventually narrow an unknown DNA profile to a specific person. The technique had already solved several high-profile cold cases around the country. Cases once considered impossible had suddenly become solvable. Investigators in Elmira began wondering whether Mary's case might also qualify. There was one problem. Advanced forensic genealogy is expensive. Many local police departments simply cannot afford the specialized laboratory work required to generate the type of DNA profile needed for genealogical analysis. The science existed. Funding did not always exist alongside it. That obstacle was removed through assistance from Season of Justice, a non-profit organization that helps finance advanced forensic testing in unsolved violent crimes. Their support allowed investigators to pursue testing that otherwise might never have happened. The case was no longer limited by local resources. It now had access to some of the most advanced forensic capabilities available. The investigation also gained support from the FBI. Special agents joined local detectives in reviewing every aspect of the case. This was no longer simply an old homicide file sitting on a shelf. It had become an active investigation once again. The evidence was sent to Othram, a forensic laboratory specializing in identifying unknown individuals and offenders through advanced DNA analysis. Scientists there faced an extraordinary challenge. The biological material remaining from 1964 was extremely limited. Decades of previous testing had consumed portions of the original evidence. Very little remained. Investigators understood what that meant. There might not be another opportunity. If this testing failed, there could be nothing left to analyze in the future. The sample was carefully prepared for shipment. Then something completely unexpected happened. As the evidence traveled to the laboratory, severe winter weather struck the central United States. A major ice storm disrupted transportation across several states. The shipment became stranded at a FedEx hub in Memphis, Tennessee. For investigators following the shipment, the delay created genuine concern. The evidence had been packaged on dry ice to preserve its condition. Every additional hour raised the possibility that the remaining biological material could deteriorate before reaching the laboratory. After 60 years of waiting, the investigation now depended not only on science but also on whether a weather system hundreds of miles away would allow a package to continue its journey. Fortunately, the shipment eventually resumed transit. The evidence reached Othram safely. The opportunity had survived. Inside the laboratory, scientists began work using techniques unimaginable in 1964. Instead of searching only for a direct DNA match, they examined thousands of genetic markers capable of identifying distant biological relationships. The process required extraordinary precision. Every usable fragment of DNA mattered. Weeks became months as scientists reconstructed a profile detailed enough for genealogical research. Meanwhile, detectives continued reviewing decades-old investigative files. Although the DNA work represented the investigation's best chance for a breakthrough, they knew scientific results would eventually need to fit within the historical evidence. If genealogy identified a possible suspect, investigators would still need to determine whether that individual could realistically have committed the crime. Around the same time, another group quietly joined the effort. Students and staff from the Criminal Investigation Research Center at Russell Sage College began assisting investigators by organizing and reviewing thousands of pages of historical case material. Their role was not to solve the murder independently. Instead, they helped transform decades of paper records into a more accessible investigative resource. Interview summaries, timelines, witness statements, and reports that had accumulated over 60 years were systematically reviewed and organized. Cold cases often depend on small details scattered across enormous files. Making that information easier to search can become just as valuable as discovering new evidence. As the genealogy work progressed, investigators found themselves approaching the case from two directions at once. Scientists were working forward from the DNA. Detectives were working backward through history. Eventually, those paths would meet. But before investigators could name a suspect, they would have to confront one of the most remarkable discoveries of the entire investigation. The man whose DNA had remained hidden for more than 6 decades had never appeared as a suspect in the original case. Not once. His name was nowhere among the hundreds of interviews conducted in 1964. He had lived in the same community. He had existed within reach of the investigation. Yet for 61 years, no one realized they had never been looking for him. The more the genetic genealogy work progressed, the narrower the investigation became. Unlike traditional detective work, investigators were no longer beginning with a suspect and searching for evidence. They were beginning with evidence and allowing the science to point them toward a family. Genealogists compared the unknown DNA profile against individuals who shared portions of the same genetic markers. None of those people was the killer. They were relatives, some close, some distant, whose family connections could be traced through public records, census documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, military records, and obituaries. Each confirmed relationship added another branch to an expanding family tree. Investigators watched as names were gradually eliminated. Entire family lines were ruled out. Generations were reconstructed. Eventually, one branch began attracting particular attention. Within that family was a man who fit the broad parameters detectives had been seeking. He had lived in Elmira in 1964. He was an adult at the time of Mary's murder. And unlike many other individuals who had been considered over the decades, he had never become part of the original investigation. His name was Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Who was he? How had he escaped notice during one of the largest homicide investigations in the city's history? And perhaps most importantly, could investigators prove that the family tree had identified the right man? Genetic genealogy is an investigative tool. By itself, it is not considered sufficient proof to close a homicide case. Detectives still needed direct confirmation. The next phase required careful planning. Investigators located one of Murray's sons and explained the nature of the investigation. According to authorities, he voluntarily agreed to provide a DNA sample. When the laboratory compared that sample to the unknown profile, the results showed exactly what investigators had hoped, and expected, to find. The relationship was consistent with a close biological connection. It was a major breakthrough. But it still wasn't enough. The investigation had reached the point where only one comparison truly mattered. The DNA recovered from Mary's case had to be compared directly to Alfred Murray, Jr. There was one unavoidable complication. He had died in 2004. There would be no interview. No interrogation. No opportunity to ask why. To obtain a definitive answer, investigators sought a court order authorizing the exhumation of Murray's remains. It was an extraordinary step, but one supported by the evidence accumulated through the genealogy investigation. In late 2025, that order was granted. Forensic specialists carefully collected the samples needed for comparison. Then investigators waited once more. When the laboratory completed its analysis, decades of uncertainty came to an end. The DNA obtained from Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. matched the biological evidence preserved from Mary's murder. According to investigators, the statistical probability that the evidence belonged to someone else was extraordinarily small, so small that it effectively eliminated any reasonable doubt about the identification. 61 years after Mary Theresa Simpson was killed, the investigation finally had its answer. On February 10, 2026, the Elmira Police Department announced publicly that the case had been solved. For the first time, authorities identified Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. as the man responsible for Mary's murder. The announcement marked the end of one of New York's oldest unsolved homicide investigations. It also brought mixed emotions. There would be no criminal trial. No guilty plea. No sentence. Murray had died more than 2 decades earlier. Justice, in the traditional legal sense, was no longer possible. What remained was accountability through evidence. For Mary's surviving family, that distinction mattered. For more than 6 decades, they had lived with uncertainty. The question of who had taken Mary's life had lingered across generations. Some relatives who had waited for answers never lived to hear them. Others stood before cameras in 2026 carrying memories that stretched back to childhood. Among them was Mary's sister, Linda Galpin, who spoke publicly after the announcement. Her remarks reflected something often overlooked in cold cases. Time does not erase loss. It simply changes the way families carry it. For investigators, the case represented more than a successful application of modern science. It demonstrated the value of persistence. The original detectives had preserved evidence that could not yet be fully understood. Successive generations refused to discard the case even when every lead had failed. Scientists developed technologies that earlier investigators could scarcely have imagined. A non-profit organization provided funding that made advanced testing possible. Federal agents contributed specialized resources. Students at Russell Sage College helped organize decades of investigative records, making them easier to navigate. Each contribution, viewed in isolation, might seem modest. Together, they solved a murder that had resisted investigation for more than 60 years. The identification of Alfred Murray, Jr. also prompted new questions. Authorities stated that they found no evidence Mary personally knew him. Based on the available evidence, investigators believe the crime most likely resulted from a chance encounter rather than an existing relationship. That conclusion underscores one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Mary appears to have been doing exactly what countless children did every day, walking home through familiar streets. Somewhere along that ordinary route, her path crossed with someone whose intentions she could not have anticipated. Police also disclosed that Murray had prior interactions with law enforcement involving offenses related to children. Authorities have not publicly detailed those incidents, nor have they announced evidence connecting him to any other homicide investigations. As of today, no additional murders have been officially attributed to him. That distinction is important. In cases involving deceased offenders, speculation can easily outpace evidence. Investigators have limited their conclusions to what they can prove. The evidence proves that Murray killed Mary Theresa Simpson. It does not establish responsibility for any other unsolved crimes. The case also illustrates how dramatically criminal investigations have evolved. In 1964, detectives relied on interviews, neighborhood canvasses, physical searches, and forensic techniques available at the time. They worked diligently but were constrained by the limits of contemporary science. 6 decades later, investigators solved the same case using technology built around microscopic quantities of DNA and sophisticated genealogical analysis. Neither investigation succeeded alone. The final outcome depended on both. Without the careful work of the original detectives, there would have been no preserved evidence to test. Without modern forensic science, the preserved evidence would have remained silent. The 2 generations of investigators were separated by more than half a century, yet each completed a part of the same investigation. Perhaps the most remarkable detail is not how the case ended, but how close it came to remaining unsolved forever. The usable DNA sample had become critically limited after years of testing. Its shipment to the laboratory was delayed by severe winter weather. Had the remaining biological material degraded before analysis, investigators may never have had another opportunity. Instead, the evidence survived. The science worked. The genealogy pointed investigators toward a family. The family tree led to Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. And a direct DNA comparison confirmed what 61 years of traditional investigation never could. Mary Theresa Simpson was 12 years old when her life was taken. For most of modern forensic history, her case existed as a reminder of an unanswered question. Today, it stands as something different. It demonstrates that justice is not measured only by the speed of an investigation but also by the determination to continue searching when answers seem impossible. Cold cases are often described as investigations frozen in time. Mary's case shows that they are not truly frozen at all. They wait. They wait for better science. They wait for forgotten evidence to become meaningful. They wait for someone willing to read one more report, revisit one more witness statement, or test one more sample. Sometimes, they wait for 61 years. In the end, Mary Theresa Simpson's story is not only about a crime committed in 1964. It is about the generations of people who refused to accept that the truth had been lost forever. The detectives who preserved evidence they could not yet use. The scientists who found answers hidden within microscopic traces. The genealogists who rebuilt an unknown family history from fragments of DNA. The students who helped organize decades of investigative records. The organizations that ensured a lack of funding would not end the search. And a family that endured a lifetime of uncertainty before finally hearing the answer they had waited decades to receive. Some questions will never be answered. No investigation can recover conversations that never took place or explain every decision made by a person who is no longer alive. But the central question that haunted Elmira for more than 6 decades has finally been resolved. The child who disappeared while walking home on a Sunday evening has her name restored not only as the victim of an unsolved mystery, but as the center of a case that proved perseverance, careful evidence preservation, and scientific innovation can still bring truth to light, even after 61 years.